Chris Claremont worked on the X-Men for 16 years, so it's natural over such a span of time he would accumulate some stories that never saw the light of day, or happened very differently than how he originally conceived them. Case in point, Gambit. Introduced a year before Claremont left the X-Men series, we knew basically nothing about Gambit when we first met him. He was a charming thief, he had energy explosion powers, that's about it. After Claremont left the X-Men, in Adjectiveless X-Men issue 8, we meet Belladonna, Gambit's wife. Gambit came from the Thieves Guild, and Belladonna is from the Assassin's Guild. Both guilds have been at war with each other for some time, and in an attempt to end the hostilities, Gambit and Belladonna got married. Then Gambit killed Belladonna's brother Julian, and was banished from New Orleans. I don't think this is necessarily a bad origin, although I do think the idea of entire clans devoted strictly to thievery and assassinary does sound pretty silly when you think about it. Plus, once I found out about the original plans Claremont had for Gambit, this new origin seemed really lackluster in comparison. The idea was that Gambit and Mister Sinister were both psychic constructs created by this kid, Nate, who was in the same orphanage with Scott Summers. Nate was apparently very long-lived and was still a kid in the present day, so he created Mister Sinister to run his criminal operations, as it's apparently very difficult to get criminals to follow your orders when you look 12 years old. Gambit was Nate's idea of what a superhero is like, dark and mysterious and flirting with the ladies, and Mister Sinister was his idea of what a bad guy is, which explains his ridiculous name and costume. In classic Marvel Figurine Collection Magazine issue 35, which focused on Gambit, Claremont went into further detail on why Nate created the Gambit persona. In his encounters with the X-Men, he saw Rogue and had the hots for her, and wanted to win her over, but he couldn't do it as a kid, or as his Mr. Sinister persona, so he created Gambit. But Gambit would eventually actually fall in love with Rogue, and would essentially gain sentience of his own, separate from Nate. This surprised me, since a lot of the Rogue Gambit stuff didn't take off until Claremont had already left the X-Men. I think there was one flirty almost kiss in issue 3 of Adjectiveless X-Men, which Claremont did right, but I had no idea Claremont had more planned for these two based on that interaction. So we have a twofer here. Would I have preferred Mr. Sinister be a kid behind the scenes doing evil stuff, and would I have preferred Gambit to be a spy who betrays his original programming? I have to say yes. I think both of these would have been better than what we got, mostly because what we got in both cases doesn't really leave much more room for more story potential. Gambit's part of an organized crime cartel, and he's exiled. That's okay, but what else are you going to do with it? We returned to Louisiana a couple of times in the following years, but once that's his backstory, there's not a whole lot left we can do with it. Years later, we find out Gambit later did work with Mr. Sinister and gathered the Marauders for him before he found out what they were going to be doing, but that's still pretty tame compared to what we could have gotten. I guess this depends on how you feel about am I a real boy type stories, like what Star Trek The Next Generation did with Data. If you like that sort of thing, I assume we would have gotten that in spades, as Gambit would be struggling with his own identity separate from what he was created for, if the X-Men were going to allow Gambit to remain with them once they found out he was spying on them. I don't know, maybe Gambit would have been asked to leave, really milk the melodrama with him and Rogue, and in that case, you could still do the am I a real boy thing, and then Claremont could have brought Gambit back to the X-Men after an extended absence, like he did with Cyclops after the Dark Phoenix saga. Either way, lots more story potential for this character than the pretty much dead end that his actual origin was. As for Sinister, what we actually got was a Victorian mad scientist who made a deal with Apocalypse to live forever. This makes the Marvel Universe feel smaller. What if this one bad guy was actually connected to another bad guy, even though we've never once seen them interact with each other until now? So I don't like that. And much like finding out Gambit was exiled from New Orleans, what comes of this revelation afterwards? Not much. I'm not sure if Essex's wife and his Faustian bargain with Apocalypse have ever really been mined for stories after this. It's another dead end. Now, I'm sure some people would have found the idea of the X-Men's biggest foe from the late 80s being a little kid to be a little weird. They definitely would have been weirded out by someone who was physically a child seeking out a sexual relationship with an adult woman. But there's at least stories to be mined here. Do the X-Men find out he's a kid, or as far as Gambit knew, was he spying for Mr. Sinister? If Gambit could break his programming, does that mean that Mr. Sinister could as well? What if Nate still loves Rogue, but Mr. Sinister doesn't, and he tries to kill her? Does Mr. Sinister continue to threaten the X-Men, or does Nate try to destroy his creation? Already, that's more than what was done with the Apocalypse connection in the comics. And I never really liked how Sinister basically devolved into an obsession with the Summers and Gray families. That's something that was present in Claremont's run on the book, but I always felt like there was more going on with the character than just that. He was responsible for the mutant massacre, and that had nothing to do with the plan to make the Ultimate Baby. So I assume if we had gotten this as Sinister's origin, we would have had more development of what he was after. Would Claremont have followed up on the why behind the mutant massacre? The explanation that Sinister recognized his scientific handiwork in the Morlocks always felt more like an afterthought to me, which it was, since that explanation came from people who weren't working in the X-Men books when the mutant massacre happen. This is pure conjecture, but I'm assuming if we had gone in this direction, Nate might have tried putting his own consciousness into the Gray Summers baby that would age at a normal rate, if he's as tired of living as a kid as Claremont seemed to intimate. Again, more story potential here than what we got with Sinister being a mad scientist who gets to live forever. So that's about it for this video. I like these ideas, but did you? Or are you satisfied with what happened with these characters? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the future. Have a good one.